When a foreign voice rises to question the legitimacy of a sovereign nation's leadership, the echo is rarely contained to the courtroom or the chambers where it was spoken. It reverberates through the halls of diplomacy, it carries across continents, and it collides with the sentiments of millions who feel the weight of injustice and the sting of disrespect. In this moment, when a powerful figure such as Clarence Thomas stands to challenge the presidency of an African leader, the world expects submission, but what unfolds instead is resistance. Resistance that reveals a continent no longer willing to bow its head, no longer willing to shrink into silence. The attempt to challenge the authority of a leader chosen by his people is not merely a political maneuver, it is a statement that certain forces still believe they can dictate the future of others. It is a statement that the voice of the African people can be disregarded, ignored, or dismissed as inferior to the dictates of foreign courts. Yet this act, intended to intimidate, has ignited a storm of solidarity, of nationalism, of pride, and of fierce determination. Instead of undermining the presidency, Clarence Thomas's move has strengthened it, proving once again that every attack against African sovereignty plants deeper roots of resilience. In the streets of Ouagadougou, in the towns and villages, and in the hearts of farmers, workers, and students, there is a growing realization that Africa must defend itself, not only against the visible forces of war and resource exploitation, but against the subtler weapons of delegitimization and external interference. What was meant to weaken a leader has instead awakened the people. It has bound them together in the certainty that their destiny cannot and will not be dictated from afar. We must understand the deeper implications of this challenge. When one of the most senior figures in the U.S. judicial system attempts to question the authority of an African president, it is not simply about the man in office. It is about the principle of self-determination. It is about the right of a people to choose their own path without being lectured or coerced by foreign actors. The backfire lies not only in the swelling resistance within Burkina Faso, but in the rising voices across the continent. From Dakar to Lagos, from Bamako to Nairobi, the message is the same. Africa will not allow its sovereignty to be questioned under the guise of foreign legality. The move by Clarence Thomas was meant to project strength, to remind Africa of its supposed vulnerability, but instead it revealed the fragility of those who still cling to outdated notions of dominance. For every sanction threatened, for every statement issued from foreign capitals, Africa has responded not with silence, but with conviction. Leaders across the continent have spoken out, and ordinary citizens have taken to social platforms and public gatherings to declare that this challenge was not against one man, but against all of Africa. The backfire is profound. Where there might have been divisions, unity has emerged. Where doubts might have lingered, confidence has been solidified. And where fear might have crept in, courage has erupted. This is the paradox of oppression. Each attempt to control, to silence, to delegitimize, creates the very opposite result. The target does not collapse, instead it rises stronger. There is also a deeper symbolic weight in Clarence Thomas's role in this story. As a man of African descent himself, his actions carry an irony so heavy it cannot be ignored. To see someone of African heritage stand at the forefront of a move to challenge African sovereignty is to see the scars of colonialism still etched into the consciousness of those who wield power within Western systems. It is a reminder that not every voice with African roots speaks for African liberation. Yet, ironically, his intervention has forced Africa to confront itself more clearly, to define its own voice more firmly, and to rally against even the most unexpected sources of pressure. The backfire, therefore, is not only political, it is psychological. It has awakened a collective awareness across Africa that sovereignty is fragile only when it is not defended, and legitimacy is in question only when it is surrendered. By standing firm, by refusing to yield, the presidency in question has become a rallying point for a continent that longs to reclaim its narrative, to wrest back its dignity from those who still see Africa as a pawn in global games. The challenge from Clarence Thomas was framed as a question of law, of democracy, of international standards, but the reality beneath it was far more transparent. It was an extension of geopolitics, a continuation of centuries-long efforts to destabilize any form of leadership in Africa that dares to stand independent of Western dictates. That is why the people understood it instantly, why the backlash was immediate, and why the backfire was so loud. They saw through the words and recognized the hand that sought to control, and when a people recognize the true nature of the struggle, they cannot be deceived, they cannot be divided. Africa has long been painted as dependent, as incapable of leading itself without external approval, but here lies the irony. Every attempt to reinforce that narrative ends up dismantling it. By questioning African leadership, Clarence Thomas did not weaken it, he gave it an opportunity to prove its legitimacy through resilience. He reminded the world that African sovereignty cannot be handed down like a favor. It is seized, defended, and enshrined by the will of its people. The world has taken notice across international forums, in diplomatic corridors, and in academic circles. The conversation has shifted. Instead of questioning African democracy, analysts now question the motives of those who seek to undermine it. Instead of discussing African instability, they discuss Western overreach, and instead of portraying Africa as weak, they highlight its unyielding defiance. This is the measure of the backfire. The narrative has flipped, and the so-called challengers now appear as aggressors, while Africa emerges as dignified and sovereign. For the United States, this was a miscalculation of historic proportions. To think that sanctions, judicial challenges, or public delegitimization would silence Africa is to remain stuck in a past that no longer exists. Africa today is not the Africa of yesterday. It is young, it is vibrant, it is connected, and it is rising. Attempts to break it only strengthen its resolve. And every misstep by Western powers serves as fuel for Africa's revolutionary fire. But the lesson here is not only for foreign actors, it is for Africans themselves. It is a reminder that unity is the most powerful defense, that legitimacy is not bestowed by foreign judges, but by the people, and that sovereignty is not negotiable. Every attack, every challenge, every attempt to destabilize must be met with resolve, with clarity, and with confidence that Africa's future lies in its own hands. So what then is the ultimate legacy of Clarence Thomas's challenge? It is not the weakening of African leadership. It is the empowerment of it. It is not the questioning of African legitimacy. It is the confirmation of it. And it is not the silencing of African voices. It is their amplification, louder and more united than before. History will not remember this moment as the triumph of foreign pressure. It will remember it as the moment Africa proved once again that it cannot be subdued, it cannot be dictated to, and it cannot be denied its right to self-determination. The backfire is complete. The lesson is clear, and the future belongs not to those who seek to control Africa, but to those who stand with Africa in its march toward true freedom. My friends, judicial authority rests on more than legal expertise. It rests on the perception of restraint and impartiality. When a judge crosses from adjudication into advocacy, especially on matters of foreign policy, the bench risks losing the moral high ground it needs to command respect. Judicial overreach does real damage. It blurs the separation of powers, fuels partisan narratives, and supplies opponents with a simple story they can use to undermine the rule of law itself. Courts are trusted because they follow procedure, weigh evidence, and render decisions within established institutional roles. A judge who uses the prestige of the office to lobby for extraterritorial measures transforms a neutral interpreter into a political actor. That transformation invites skepticism about motives and evidence. Citizens who once trusted the bench begin to ask whether rulings serve justice or politics. When that doubt spreads, institutional legitimacy erodes. The practical consequences are immediate. Advocacy by a jurist can prompt a politicized cascade. Executive branches feel pressured to act, diplomats are thrust into crisis management, and publics polarize around competing narratives. Rather than clarifying facts, the spectacle creates frames, external imposition or judicial crusade that simplify complexities and mobilize sympathies. The result is not a tidy legal outcome, but a messy political conflict that often protects the very behaviors the original action sought to correct. There is also a damage to process effect. Justice that bypasses method invites contestation of every subsequent step. Evidence presented in the political theater loses its force in courtrooms precisely because the stage for its introduction was not neutral. Appeals, procedural challenges, and institutional backlash multiply, delaying resolution and wasting scarce credibility. Judicial actors must therefore exercise prudence. If a judge sees facts suggesting misconduct with international implications, the responsible path is to call for independent inquiry, refer matters to competent prosecutorial bodies, or request that evidence be examined by neutral fact-finding commissions. Use the bench to insist on standards, demand transparency, subpoena power where lawful, and procedural safeguards, but avoid issuing policy prescriptions that belong to elected branches or diplomatic channels. Finally, the public has a stake in preserving judicial impartiality. Citizens should defend courts from politicization just as zealously as they defend them from capture. When judges act with humility, insisting on process over spectacle, they strengthen the very institutions that deliver lasting justice. Overreach may win headlines, but restraint wins legitimacy. And legitimacy is the single most durable protection against impunity and abuse. My friends, when an outside power appears to point a finger at our leaders, it does more than critique policy. It touches a deeper nerve, the right of a people to govern themselves. Sovereignty and national pride are not mere abstractions. They are felt in kitchens, markets, schools, and places of worship. When those intangible bonds are threatened, even citizens who disagree with a government instinctively circle the wagons. That reflex is ancient and powerful. People protect the space where they argue, choose, and correct their own affairs. Perception matters enormously. A punitive act that looks like external punishment, especially one delivered in public or through blunt instruments like sanctions, is easily reframed as humiliation. Humiliation produces a political immune response. Instead of fragmenting a coalition, it often forges one. Opposition figures who ordinarily dispute policy find common cause in defending national dignity. Business leaders who would otherwise criticize the state worry more about survival than ideology. Ordinary families ask first how their children will eat, not whose rhetoric was justified. The optics transform complex allegations into a straightforward narrative. We will not be dictated to. That simple frame mobilizes emotion faster than facts can travel. History amplifies this dynamic. Many societies carry memories of external meddling, economic pressure, covert influence, or outright intervention that left lasting scars. Those memories make citizens skeptical of motives behind foreign pressure. Even legitimate concerns, if aired externally, risk invoking those painful recollections. Thus, a measure intended to punish malfeasance can be read as another episode in a long story of outside control. And it will often trigger solidarity across classes and regions. But solidarity born of pride is double-edged. It can protect against imperial overreach, and it can shield wrongdoing. The civic task is to convert that solidarity into constructive energy, insist on sovereign processes, not impunity. National pride should be the reason we demand our own institutions work better, not a pretext to close ranks around malpractice. Use the moment to demand transparent inquiry, robust parliamentary oversight, and public audits that satisfy both domestic audiences and skeptical external partners. Leaders and civil society share responsibilities here. Leaders must avoid exploiting foreign pressure for partisan gain. They should channel popular sentiment towards strengthening institutions. Civil society must refuse false choices, patriotism or accountability, and insist on both. When pride and process march together, resistance becomes reform. Sovereignty and national pride intensify resistance. Let them also motivate renewal. Defend the right to self-determination by building the mechanisms that make it worthy of defense. My friends, we must face an uncomfortable truth. When states reach for sanctions, the first to feel the pain are rarely the powerful people who made the decisions. They are the market women, the bus drivers, the school cooks, and the farmers who sell in local markets. Sanctions are often presented as precise tools aimed at officials or institutions, but in practice economies are interconnected webs. When credit lines tighten, import costs rise, and transport slows, ordinary households pay in bread, medicine, and school fees. Think of daily life. A truck that cannot cross a border because of frozen banking or heightened inspections means a stallholder with no stock for a week. A delayed container of fertilizer raises the cost of planting season, yields fall, incomes shrink, and food prices climb. Hospitals that relied on international suppliers face shortages of essential medicines. Teachers may go unpaid for a month. When livelihoods are precarious, these disruptions do not remain statistical abstractions. They are meals skipped, lessons missed, and children pushed out of school. There is a moral dimension too. The rhetoric of moral sanctions suggests a clean separation between guilty elites and an innocent populace. Reality rarely conforms. Elites often have diversified assets, access to informal channels, and the means to insulate themselves from shocks. Ordinary people, by contrast, operate on thin margins. The effect is that measures intended to coerce wrongdoers can instead entrench inequality and erode the social compact that binds citizens to the state. Sanctions also distort markets and foster rent-seeking. When formal channels dry up, informal ones expand. Smugglers and monopolists step in to fill gaps, charging higher prices and capturing rents that should accrue to broader communities. The result is not merely hardship, it is perverse enrichment for a few and deeper disenfranchisement for the many. This reality imposes an ethical obligation on those who advocate for coercive measures. Design must be surgical, targeted asset freezes, narrow travel bans on named individuals, and explicit humanitarian carve-outs for food, medicine, and essential services. Oversight is essential, independent monitoring to ensure exemptions work in practice, not just on paper. Banks and logistics firms should be guided, not terrorized into compliance, so that life-saving trade continues. But technical fixes are not enough. We must demand that sanctions be accompanied by mitigation, emergency cash transfers to vulnerable households, temporary subsidies for staple foods, and support programs for small businesses and transporters. Humanitarian corridors must be protected and communicated clearly to avoid overcompliance that chokes aid. Finally, citizens and policymakers must remember that justice pursued at the cost of mass suffering is self-defeating. If the goal is accountability, do not weaponize the livelihoods of the innocent. Insist on proportionality, transparency, and protections that keep the most vulnerable from becoming the primary casualties of policies aimed at the powerful. My friends, durable justice is built at home and strengthened across our neighborhoods. Domestic and regional processes are not optional extras. They are the plumbing of accountable governance. When allegations arise, citizens rightly ask, who will examine the facts, who will hold people to account, and whose judgment will be trusted? The best answer is one that begins domestically: impartial prosecutors, empowered parliaments, independent courts, and auditors with teeth. These bodies carry legitimacy because they are embedded in our laws, our languages, and our shared civic life. When they function, they produce evidence, allow adversarial testing, and render judgments that citizens can see as their own. That legitimacy matters because it resists the easy narrative that foreign pressure is the only recourse. Yet domestic capacity is sometimes limited, especially in states recovering from conflict or under-resourced by design. That is where regional mechanisms become indispensable. Regional courts, commissions, and joint fact-finding missions bring external expertise without the stigma of distant coercion. A mission convened by neighboring states or a continental body carries the authority of peers and can mediate facts, reduce bias, and help build prosecutorial capacity. It translates grievances into shared rules of verification, so findings are not dismissed as partisan claims. Regional processes respect sovereignty while recognizing that some problems require collective action. Both levels, domestic and regional, must observe core principles. Transparency is non-negotiable. Procedures, evidence chains, and methodologies must be public and auditable. Due process must be protected. The accused must have counsel, the right to respond, and access to appeal. Proportionality should guide remedies. Measures should target culpable actors and shield civilians from collateral harm. And timeliness matters. Endless delay corrodes trust as surely as hasty spectacle. Capacity building is an investment in prevention. International partners should prioritize funding for forensic units, prosecutorial training, and digital procurement systems that leave fewer shadows for abuse. But capacity aid must be designed with safeguards. multi-stakeholder oversight, civil society participation, and transparent reporting so assistance strengthens institutions rather than creating dependencies. Finally, domestic and regional processes create a virtuous cycle. Strong national inquiries reduce the temptation for outsiders to act. Credible regional adjudication discourages unilateral coercion. Together they lower the political temperature and make constructive diplomacy possible. Citizens can then choose justice that punishes the guilty and protects the innocent, not as an imposition, but as a product of collective agency. Insist on those processes. Demand no less than scrutiny that is competent, fair, and homegrown, supported where necessary by honest neighbors, and you preserve both sovereignty and the rule of law. My friends, true justice is not the swift satisfaction of outrage, it is the steady work of procedure. In moments of shock and anger, the instinct to act quickly can feel noble, but haste without method is false courage. It breeds mistakes, fuels grievance, and corrodes the very legitimacy that punishment is meant to defend. If our aim is not the spectacle of retribution but the lasting restoration of right, then we must choose processes that test evidence, protect rights, and withstand political pressure. Process begins with careful fact-finding. Evidence must be collected professionally, preserved securely, and verified by neutral experts. Forensic audits, chain of custody protocols, and documented interviews do not slow justice to frustrate it. They ensure that conclusions rest on rock rather than rumor. When findings emerge from disciplined inquiry, they survive scrutiny and are defensible even to skeptics. Without them, verdicts are fragile and reversal invites cynicism. Due process protects us all, the right to counsel, the opportunity to respond to accusations, and the ability to appeal are not privileges for the few, they are safeguards that keep justice from tipping into vengeance. When an accused person is denied fair hearing, a society trades a short-term triumph for a long-term fracture. Citizens who see courts as impartial are more likely to accept difficult outcomes. Citizens who see courts as instruments of haste will not. Transparency is the oxygen of legitimacy. Publish reports in clear language, hold public hearings where appropriate, and summarize technical findings for ordinary citizens. Openness does not mean exposing sensitive intelligence that endangers lives, but it does mean allowing the public to see methods, timelines, and safeguards. When people can follow the process, trust grows. When processes are opaque, rumor fills the gaps and anger hardens. Proportionality ensures remedies fit the harm. Justice that is calibrated, targeted sanctions, restitution, corrective policy changes, or criminal penalties where warranted, avoids collective punishment and isolates culpability. Sweeping measures applied to entire communities for the sins of a few foster resentment and undercut moral claims. Finally, institutionalize learning. Create review mechanisms that publish lessons learned and reform procedures accordingly. Train investigators, judges, and prosecutors in forensics and ethics. Fund independent bodies that can withstand political winds. A durable system is one that improves with use rather than collapsing under stress. Speed can be seductive. Process is sober. The former gratifies the moment. The latter secures the future. If we want justice that endures, we must make the hard choice. Prefer the slow rigor of fair procedure over the quick gratification of rash punishment. In doing so, we protect the innocent, hold the guilty accountable, and preserve the civic trust that makes collective life possible.